Chris Nunn, I'm the Head of Sustainability for AMP Capital Real Estate. And I thought I'd just step back a moment from the detail of the design to talk about who AMP Capital is and who our parent AMP is, and the sustainability strategy that has informed the production of this tower, or the sustainability aspects of the tower. So AMP is a large financial services organisation. It's actually one of Australia's oldest companies. It has a 167-year heritage and about $226 billion worth of assets under management, making it a really big player in the Asia Pacific. That's primarily derived from our parent in terms of superannuation, pension schemes, financial. We have a really large network of financial planners, a life insurance business, and we're also a retail bank. And AMP has about 5,500 staff, and that's the parent company for AMP Capital, who I work for. AMP Capital is an investment management firm. We take money invested by institutional investors and place it in a variety of different asset classes. We have about $165 billion worth of funds under management on behalf of our investors, placed in things like Australian and international equities, in terms of fixed income, corporate bonds, infrastructure, directly holding infrastructure around the world. And we have a $23 billion real estate portfolio, primarily in Australia, but also in New Zealand. And we have about 1,100 staff in AMP Capital. And that $23 billion in the real estate fund is held under a series of vehicles. AMP Capital Wholesale Office Fund and AMP Capital Diversified Property Fund are the two ownership vehicles for Quay Quarter Tower. We have about 80 assets under management, consisting of about 100 buildings. Some of those 80 are significant precincts, and that's about 27 shopping centres, 28 office towers and 25 industrial buildings, and almost half of the staff of AMP Capital are in the real estate business. So it's a really significant player in real estate in Australia. And this is our sustainability strategy. It has 3 pillars: environment, social and governance, and you can see the themes there. I won't go into detail, but it touches on energy and climate and waste and water, the things you would typically expect, but it has a strong social and governance dimension. So social around the health and well-being of the occupants in all of our buildings, a placemaking dimension, building culture and creating a sustainable community, and governance in terms of de-risking assets from an investor's perspective through the policies and processes that we have in place. And this is a snapshot of one of our sustainability strategies for the fund that owns the Quay Quarter Tower. And I really just wanted to highlight some of the elements in red. So all of the AMP Capital Wholesale Office funds have an aspiration to be zero net carbon by 2030. So we're really setting a strong mark in the sand in terms of future aspirations. And all our new developments are aiming to be 5.5-star NABERS energy rating. So NABERS is the National Australian Built Environment Rating Scheme, and that's the way we rate the energy efficiency of buildings in Australia, particularly commercial buildings. And finally, down on the bottom right, we also have an aspiration to be 6-star Green Star, which is a bit like LEED if you're from the US or BREEAM from the UK. And so those 3 targets, the 5.5-star NABERS, the 6-star Green Star, and the zero carbon aspiration, have really manifested themselves in the built form at Quay Quarter Tower. So not only is it energy efficient from the facade perspective, I think that's one of the key stories we'll continue to talk about long after people have forgotten about the ratings perhaps, but the facade reduces the solar gains, and Rob will talk about that. And the reuse of the concrete core is another really wonderful sustainability story that we can tell. But I also wanted to focus on why sustainability is such an important aspect of the design of office buildings in Australia. We see really strong customer demand for sustainability in terms of the key anchor tenants that you would want to attract into a tower like this all have corporate social responsibility policies, and they want to attract and retain the best staff, and they need to, in order to do that, they want to be a tenant in a green building, and that's one of the key ways they can really demonstrably show their staff that they have a commitment to sustainability. So we need to be their partner in delivering that on that expectation of an exceptional real estate experience that has green credentials. Also, our investors have really high expectations around sustainability and there's 2 components to that. One is that they want to de-risk their money from sustainability risk. They don't want any of their assets to be at risk from the physical aspects of climate change, the physical impacts of climate change, or from the less tangible reputational issues associated with perhaps labour practices in the supply chain. So they're things that can really come back and bite a brand and hurt an investor's returns. So we want to deliver on those expectations. And there's also a growing pool of money globally searching for green investments. So there's impact investors, and we have an impact investor as one of our clients, invested in the funds that own Quay Quarter Tower and through the vehicle AMP Capital Wholesale Office Fund, and that's the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, who put $100 million into AWOF as a fund on the strength of our aspirations to be zero carbon by 2030 and to build developments like Quay Quarter Tower, which have those strong sustainability credentials. And we know that this adds to the financial performance and the returns of a building. We know that green credentials correlate to higher capital values, lower vacancy rates, and better returns overall. There are studies in Sydney that demonstrate that correlation really metrically. And we also have a really strong regulatory regime in Australia. The Commercial Building Disclosure Scheme means that all commercial office buildings over 2,000 square metres must disclose their neighbours' energy performance. So it's a matter of public record. Everybody knows how sustainable your building is. And that's driven a really strong level of competition in the Australian market, particularly in this premium office asset class, to be the best, because everyone knows with full transparency how you're performing. So that was really just a bit of scene setting from me. I'd now like to pass over to Rob Saidman, who'll talk about some of the ways that the Quay Quarter Tower design has lived these values of sustainability that are enshrined in our sustainability strategy.
My name's Rob Saidman. As Eve mentioned, I lead the building services team at Arup in Sydney. And I've been working on this project for about 7 years now. I actually had hair at the start of this project. You've heard about Chris's discussion about the AMP portfolio-wide strategy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of those initiatives have manifested themselves within the building design. I'm not going to focus on, it's not really a story about eco-bling, it's just going to try and tease out the key initiatives that took place in the building and the things that we're quite proud of from a sustainability perspective. So I'm going to take you through, I'm hopefully going to take you through. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about the history of the site and the significance of the site. We're going to talk about this notion of upcycling and embodied carbon. I'm hopefully going to convince you that facades with external shading are a wonderful thing, or at least can be when designed correctly. Fred already touched a little bit on the benefits of amenity and providing amenity in terms of workspace, and I'm going to talk about how that relates to productivity, and finally I'll give you a little bit of a talk about the future and what we see coming up next. So Quay Quarter Sydney is intrinsically linked to the European history of the site and a key part of Sydney Cove. The first permanent structures were erected somewhere around 1850. You can see them there adjacent to Customs House. There were a combination of store buildings, a couple of warehouses, a hotel, all things that merchants would provide. And then it wasn't until 1870 that Morton Co. built their wool store at the corner of Bridge and Alfred, and that's the one that you can see over the larger one, the 5-storey one on the left-hand side. It was really the era of wool. That was the main, the staple of the economy. And now Morton Co. was a leading, if not the premier, wool broking house in the world at the time. And they were selling brokers for everything from grains to sheepskin, and they actually even acted or conducted a large banking business for their country clients. Mort had a strong association with the AMP Society as one of its founding fathers, so it was kind of the birth of financial services within Sydney Cove, so pretty significant. During this period, or just beyond this period, Sydney established its tram network. And there was a loop that came past the site going down to Circular Quay and back up to Central and around. And that was decommissioned in the 1930s. And for our international guests, you probably noticed the chaos in the streets. There's a bit of historical deja vu that we're reintroducing the trams back into Sydney. So the wool stores continued to dominate the precinct until the 1950s. But ultimately, the Morton Co. site was demolished to make way for subsequent developments. So why is this the case? What happened? Well, obviously, wool was no longer the staple of the economy, and it wasn't the right sustainable use of that land anymore. There were trends coming out of the US for real estate to be used in a taller manner, and it just wasn't an effective use of the site any longer. So 33 Alfred Street was born out of that, a beautiful piece of architecture, in my opinion, designed by Peddlethorpe and Walker. And subsequently, the remaining wool stores were demolished to make way for 50 Bridge Street, which you can see here in an article released at the time. It was a bargain for $21 million. It's obviously the tower in the rear. And it was another first for AMP. It surpassed the 600 feet mark and was again the tallest building in Sydney at the time. It received a bunch of accolades comparing it to other significant buildings at the time, and was a success for AMP. Now, fast forward about 40 years, and AMP have got some serious thinking to do about what to do with the asset. Mostly to keep it relevant. There's a bunch of other high-rise buildings of a premium grade nature popping up around the area. Legislation is sweeping in, driving energy efficiency upgrades. There's a bit more of a tendency towards sustainability, as Chris mentioned. Tenants are expecting it, and just to remain competitive, the building needed to be repositioned. So how could they go about that? How could they harness the existing environmental constraints, the solar orientation, the wind, the prevailing noise conditions on the site? Well, there was quite a challenge. So when we first had a look at the building, and when I went through it around 2010, 2011, it was characterized by a facade that of its day was a good facade, but obviously facade technology has moved along substantially. New glazing systems with high performance now prevail. It suffered from a bit of leakage, not the best spandrel insulation. Also, mechanical systems suffered from reheat, so the energy performance wasn't great, and the water performance, as a subsequent consequence, wasn't great. And effectively, we had an A-grade building in a premium-grade part of town. There's some figures that were released from Towner and Townsend recently, revealing that over the last decade, operational costs for commercial buildings have increased by double the rate of inflation and 4 times the rate of construction costs. Operational costs, more so than ever, are an important thing in terms of building design. And AMP realized that something had to be done to move with the times and get back in step with the rest of the market. Fortunately, the building did have a few things going for it. Center core, with a good span to columns at the perimeter, column free space, a good depth, as Fred would probably say, good access to daylight and views, and that structure. So it's an existing structure comprised of steel frame with concrete encased steel columns linked back to reinforced concrete shear walls within the core for stability. Now, that existing structure represented an opportunity, one that's not really considered in building design as often as perhaps it should be. If you think of all the embodied carbon that went into creating that structure, the labor, the materials, the time to bring it all to site and the effort to bring it to site, a substantial amount of energy. And we are seeing a growing trend towards recognizing that energy in terms of building design. It's not quite there yet, but it's going to come. Operational carbon, which you can see in blue, is still the focus of most building owners and still the focus of most tools. So Green Star here, LEED, BREEAM, elsewhere in the world, we're all driving down that blue component as much as we can. It's great awareness. But as that is becoming smaller and smaller, the other part of the carbon story, the embedded carbon or embodied carbon, is becoming more important. And I kind of challenge you to think about a world where reductions in embodied carbon, or at least an awareness of it with some targets, becomes part of legislation. Because I think it's going to come. It's a matter of time. It's being spoken about in the UK, and it will happen here as well. So as you heard from Fred in simplistic terms, and also in simplistic terms from a humble mechanical engineer, snipping off the edge of the core, I'm sure ADG and BG&E will tell you it's more complicated than that. But the carbon saving is substantial. We're talking about 10,000 flights worth of carbon between Sydney and Melbourne, just by retaining that bit of structure. Now, the other tricks that I like to think of in terms of embodied carbon, which are important, is use of space. How efficient we are with our cores is vital to the success of these developments in terms of the feasibility, as well as in terms of the sustainability story. And you can imagine the challenge of adding 40,000 square meters and near doubling of the area, intensifying the services, bringing them along from A grade to premium grade, increasing the density up to 1 person per 8 square meters, more outside air. All of those characteristics add pressure onto the core. So space is a very important factor to consider. So what did we do? We worked really hard at it with BVN and 3XN and the rest of the design team, but we repurposed electrical risers. We took unutilized riser space and turned it into hydraulic risers. And we used the lowest space take possible mechanical services systems, which are hydronic based, to ensure space was used efficiently. But the greatest influence, however, was the lifting, far and above. So what we had to do was take a lift strategy from a 1970s type solution to meet the expectations of 2020 and beyond. So Peter Tomlinson, who led our vertical transportation team, looked at a range of options, everything from single deck, twins, double deck. And while double deck is less conventional here in Sydney, it's fairly common elsewhere in the world. For a building of this scale, it's quite an appropriate response. And to our knowledge, so double deck is where we ended up, and it'll be the first example of a double deck solution going into an existing building in Australia, and to our knowledge, the world. But the benefits to this approach are immense. 9 lift shafts saved by avoiding the traditional single deck approach, but not without its challenges. Wayfinding, simple and intuitive for the upper deck and lower deck, so important. And the team's done a great job of that between Tom, Fred, and the team at BVN, making sure that it's just clear and easy to know how to navigate through the building. But then you get some of the quirks of the existing building. So the existing floor-to-floors are all a little bit different in an existing building. We have some natural breaks where the plant room is at level 20, and we've got a nice big floor-to-floor. And that struck out how the risers would work within the lift. And then we used the raised floor to take up the slack on those subtle differences as structure settles over time. We also had to find a way to accommodate double height lift motor rooms, which is quite a challenge in an existing building, but we found a way. And just simple things like determining the verticality of a lift shaft and the plumbness to make sure that cars would be able to fit in the future was an important thing. But the outcome is astounding. It was well worth the work. We went from a building with an existing core shown in blue, superimposed over the final design. We intensified it, as I said, almost doubled the area, brought it back up to PCA premium grade and code compliance by only adding about 30% more core space. And that was, the double deck were really a big part of that. And if we'd gone a single deck solution, this is what it would have looked like. 120 square meters of additional space, about 6,000 square meters across the tower. Never mind the commercial implications of that for the feasibility, but the sustainability is also benefited by avoiding this. I mean, that would have been a whole lot of structure that we would have had to have constructed, about 100 or several hundred thousand kilograms of CO2. The building services played their part as well in terms of the sustainability solution. The usual suspects, LED lighting throughout with daylight harvesting, mechanical services solutions being hydronic based, which I mentioned. But the thing I quite like the most, and Fred touched on it, we've used the wedge cuts, the base of each wedge cut, to just neatly insert the plant rooms at the break of each block. So they're barely noticeable. But in doing so, because they're at regular intervals, we've reduced the amount of energy we need to push the air around the building. So it all just fits together very neatly. And now onto facade. As I said, I'm going to try and convince you of the merits of an externally shaded facade. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'll give it a go. We were really pleased to see 3XN including shading in their design philosophy. It really gave our building physics team to then optimize an already sound principle and strong design principle. So the steps we did, we modeled the surrounding context, get an understanding of the peak solar incident and the orientation, and pretty clearly that northern exposure is a substantial one, as is the one to the west. We then used Rhino and Grasshopper, which are software tools, coupled with an in-house tool as well to model the geometry of the shade, which you can see here. And what that allowed us to do is very quickly iterate on the whole range of factors that influence the geometry and relate them back to thermal comfort, back to glare, back to compliance for our local legislation. And as we went through that process, we realized that the right response was to tilt the shade ever so slightly. And in doing so, it allowed us to minimize the material we used. It gave us very effective shading in terms of glare control. And very importantly for the architecture, it allowed the visual light transmission to be raised as high as possible. So we're above 50% visual light transmission for a nice clear facade. And one of the lesser known or lesser considered aspects was also the BMU, so the building maintenance unit, how we really wanted to avoid the need for telescopic arms for cleaning. So that depth was carefully struck to avoid that need, which minimized operational costs. And the outcome, as Fred said before, total annual solar radiation reduced by 30%. The glare, though, is, I think, the most compelling story. Inevitably, we see a lot of buildings north-facing which have great views but suffer from needing the blinds down. This building won't be like that because of the shade. It obviously still has sometimes where for direct solar radiation it's required, but those summer days, which are beautiful, the sun is high, that shade is working very hard. As a result, the building outperforms a conventional clean skin facade quite substantially. Now, there can hardly be anything more important than our own health and well-being, and most employers recognise that a healthy, happy workforce is a vital component of a successful business. Staff costs in a typical business constitute about 90% of total business operating costs. And as a result, small variations in the performance of staff have a large impact on the total performance of an organisation. We know that the aggregate cost towards businesses of absenteeism is about $7 to $8 billion a year to Australia. And presenteeism, you might have heard of, it's you're there, but you're not really there because of ill health or lack of productivity, and that attributes close to $30 billion a year. So there's this overwhelming evidence that demonstrates that the design of an office and the workspace can impact the overall performance and productivity of its occupants. And 3XN, as Fred showed before, and the design team have responded to that excellently. These atria spaces with a focus on workplace design, interconnection, beautifully daylit, are integral to that. Some of you might be aware of the Liceman Surveys. The highest Liceman, they're essentially a survey of several thousand workspaces. The highest performers are always ones with atria, particularly ones which allow a great connection of staff. Beyond that, obviously, the green spaces and the amenity that brings is fantastic. And finally, the podium, which is a retreat for people to go to, which Tom will talk about, is so essential in that story as well. So all of these initiatives that I've spoken about have landed in exemplar ratings for Green Star, which is our lead or BREEAM equivalent. We're looking to achieve a 6-star rating, and Neighbours a 5.5-star commensurate with the targets that Chris mentioned. The story, though, that I think is probably most important, apart from the ratings, which are given for a building of this nature, is where is it going to go? What is the future going to look like? We need to ensure that this building is relevant now and into the future. So to this end, AMPC have recognised that technology is the current tall building disruptor. These days, people have an expectation that their workspaces will be digitally enabled, that buildings will help facilitate seamless and digitally rich experiences, which will remove that friction and frustration from their typical working day. So the Arup digital team in Sydney have been working really closely with AMP over the last little while to define the experiences and the associated technologies which will unlock the best possible outcomes for tenants and for building owners. Ultimately, it'll be these digital initiatives which will ensure that this development will be future-proof for the years to come, and ensure it won't end up much like the wool era. Yeah, look, in conclusion, we think that the things that are special about this building is that level of reuse and the operational carbon combined with the embodied carbon. The benefits that we see out of the facade are fantastic, and we're hoping to see a great building as a result.